So again, thank you everyone very much for being here today. As my title suggests, I'd like to discuss race and religion in the context of the German Middle Ages today. And I'd like to think a little bit about why looking at how race is actually perceived, how it's actually considered in the Middle Ages more broadly and in the German Middle Ages more specifically. Why that is a very timely and very important matter. And it's because we've seen recently with the resurgence of far-right movements throughout Europe and the Western world, we've seen also a resurgence of the medieval past being used and I would say appropriated and abused as a kind of ideological tool for a range of different purposes and to further a range of ideologies. And I'm going to focus, as I said, on extreme right ideologies. So modern perception of the Middle Ages in both politics, but also actually in pop culture, and I'm happy to discuss this in more details in the Q&A, tend to rely on kind of two polarized extreme of viewing the Middle Ages. On the one hand, we have the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages as this era of ignorance, of death and disease, where everyone dies very young and everyone is stupid and believes that the earth is flat. And spoiler alert, it is very, very unlikely that anyone really ever believed the earth was flat in the Middle Ages. So this is one extreme. On the other hand, we have the Middle Ages being used as a kind of site of origin, as a mode of nostalgia in which Europeans can find genealogy. And as I mentioned, more often than not, this kind of imagined medieval past is particularly appealing to the far right, who hope to find in the Middle Ages a kind of white Christian genealogy. So while the first extreme that I mentioned, this idea of the medieval as something that is dark and barbarous, is often used by political leaders across the board. The second extreme, this idea of the white Middle Ages, sees far-right political leaders claim historical figures as legitimizing examples for their own ideologies in various different countries. In most recent years, we've seen, for example, the Front National in French and Marine Le Pen reclaiming the legacy of Joan of Arc for a supposedly true French identity. We've seen the riots in Charlottesville, the heavily racist riots using Viking runes and supposedly medieval symbolism. We've seen the EDL in England using the Knights Templar as a sort of example to follow. We've seen the Identitäre Bewegung in Germany using words like Reconquista to recall this idea of a supposedly religiously motivated fight between Christians and Muslims. Similarly, we've seen this is a symbol of a far-right group called Reconquista Germanica. So the same kind of ideas of the medieval past being used as a supposed site of origins. And the problem with these appropriations and with the fact that the Middle Ages come to mean kind of anything and its opposite is that the medieval becomes a sort of empty signifier, one that commands authority and legitimacy by relying on the past while being conjured, as I said, to evoke one thing and its opposite. So, for example, I'd forgotten this one, but that's an AfD politician talking about how the decline of Europe is a new Middle Ages. So this is a negative appropriation of the Middle Ages, again, for a far-right ideology. So Andrew B.R. Elliott, in this book that I highly recommend, and if anybody would like, a PDF of the introduction, I'm very happy to send it to you. Explains that these usages means that if for the mass media, the medieval can mean anything from primitive to non-Western, then it has potentially lost any meaning in its permanent reuse by anyone with a keyboard and an internet connection. So what Elliott is advocating for here is to kind of reclaim narratives of race and of difference from the Middle Ages to kind of see really what is going on in the Middle Ages rather than what is going on in what people think the Middle Ages were online in these kind of forums. So attempting to rectify these appropriations does not mean presenting an idyllic version of the Middle Ages as this era of absolute peace and tolerance. This was not the case, but rather what I'd like to do is try and reclaim the nuances and the historical complexities of the Middle Ages as they are presented to us in texts and documents, to kind of, think about how the Middle Ages end up in these narratives, and how how the Middle Ages do not actually end up representing whatever ideologies these groups might like them to represent. So again, it's not my intention to pretend that there was no racism in the Middle Ages or no bigotry of any kind. Rather, what I'd like to do is to give you an idea of what sorts of understanding of race and what sorts of understanding of alterity exist in the medieval world. So scholarship has long questioned whether categories such as race are even appropriate to talk about the Middle Ages, especially since the idea of race in its post-Enlightenment construction relies mostly on skin color and physical differences. And this understanding of race does not map onto medieval conceptions of difference very well. It remains important to discuss medieval race or race in relation to the Middle Ages, if anything, to point to some continuities in the pre-modern and the modern in terms of discrimination and alienation, but it's equally important to anchor these considerations in medieval conceptions of the world and in medieval systems of knowledge. Then I follow here Suzanne Conklin-Akbari, who tells us, once the medieval system of knowledge is well mapped out, it becomes impossible to assess with some accuracy what kind of paradigm shifts took place to make it possible in the early modern period to perceive race as inherited, immutable, and polluting. So the main factor that determines difference or alterity in a way that leads to alienation and discrimination in the Middle Ages is actually religion. There is a tendency in modern scholars, often influenced by race theories and racial discourses stemming from the United States, to search for kind of a binary predicated on a white or non-white skin color in the Middle Ages. However, the only strict binary that determines otherness in a medieval sense is, as I said, right belief and wrong belief. So it is religion. And you might think, if you have any experience of medieval literature, of a very famous aphorism that happens in a very famous French medieval text, the Chanson de Roland, where a line says, "Pagans are wrong, Christians are right." This is kind of the leading understanding of difference in the Middle Ages. By contrast, bodily diversity in the medieval era functions on what can be better described as a spectrum, with on one end the normative European body, and on the other end, we go all the way to kind of monstrous races inhabiting the very edge of the world. So the spectrum is very, very broad in terms of bodily diversity. And the spectrum finds its root in these medieval systems of knowledge that Akbari talks about on this slide, specifically in medieval cosmographical frameworks that differ from our own in very significant ways. So looking, for example, at some medieval maps to understand how medieval people understand the world, you can see here, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but I'm looking at the map on the left. You can see here an example of what we call a T and O map, somewhat simply because it literally looks like a T inside of an O. The explanation is very simple. That show that the world in the Middle Ages is represented with Asia on the top, so Asia being the leading cardinal point, and Asia being understood more generally to mean the Middle East and what we now call Asia. And this is because the Garden of Eden is thought to be located in Asia, therefore it takes primacy as kind of the main place. And of course, you can also notice that there is no clear sense of the continent of America, therefore it is not on the map. So this is one perception of the world. The other is the second map that you can see here, which is called the Macrobian map, after Macrobius, who first explained them. And these are maps that understand the world depending on its climates. So the extremes, the red regions, would be inhabitable because too cold, the middle is inhabitable because too hot, and then the white parts are just right. So this is where humans kind of thrive. And the idea of the Macrobian maps in turns is found or influences perceptions of physical markers of alterity. So there is a sense also that these climates influence bodily, influence the bodies of the people who live in these climates, where people becoming blacker the hotter it gets, is essentially how this is described. So again, there is an idea in the medieval world that the discourse of racial difference is not predicated on binarism, there is a norm, and then there is greater or lesser deviation from that norm. But the binary that we really find is a religious one. Again, right belief, wrong belief. And obviously I'm talking from a German-speaking perspective here, so the right belief is Christianity in a lot of our examples. So how do these discourses of kind of physical markers of race and religion intersect? Oh, this is a great map. I just added it last minute to try and show you, but when I was talking about the monstrous races that form part of this spectrum of physical difference, you can see them here in the corner. So this is a TNO model of a map with God at the top, Garden of Eden. Jerusalem is obviously at the center. You have Europe on this side, Africa here. And then on the very far right is a corner of the world that we haven't really mapped out yet. And that's where all the little monsters live. And again, if anybody would like to look at these closer, I'm happy to send them to you by email. So how do these discourses on physical markers of race and religion intersect? So I'll be considering two examples quite briefly today, one historical or semi-historical and one purely literary. And the first of these is St. Maurice, a Christian saint and patron of the Cathedral of Magdeburg, named after him. St. Maurice is a sorry, I went back. St. Maurice is a martyr from the 3rd century of the Common Era. And according to the hagiography, meaning this text by Eucherius, Bishop of Lyon, the Passio Martyrum Agaunensium, or the Passion of the Martyrs of Agaunum, he fought in the Theban Legion of the Roman Empire, the Theban Legion being a group of soldiers from Thebes in Egypt, so kind of south of Egypt, so almost what is now Sudan, but just a little bit above. And he, according to the hagiography, he was called with his legion to fight in Gaul by the Emperor Maximian in the 3rd century. And when they arrived, the emperor told them, you need to kill the Christians or make sacrifices to the pagan gods. And he and his fellow soldiers refused, and they were all executed or martyred within the hagiographical framework. So the one of the evidence that Maurice existed is that his body was later found on Christmas 960. St. Maurice's remain were brought first to what is now in modern day Switzerland, the town of Saint-Maurice in Valais, where it is thought that the martyrdom actually happened according to Eucherius. And on Christmas 960, his remains were brought to the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I at Regensburg in a first instance, and then to Magdeburg, where Otto founded the cult of St. Maurice with those remains. And he remains patron to this day. The story of Maurice, the veneration of St. Maurice, exists in some form in large parts of the Middle Ages, especially in German-speaking Europe. However, he really becomes a major saint in the first half of the 13th century. And representations of St. Maurice in the first half of the 13th century really begin to flourish. And this is partly due to the fact that his skull was apparently recovered by crusaders in Constantinople in 2020, sorry, my dates are all wrong today, in 1220, and brought to the bishopric of Magdeburg, who bought this skull. I should add that this slightly morbid fascination with body, bones and body parts and skulls is a very, very medieval practice of relics. If you go to any, I'm sure if you visited any medieval cathedral, you will see in a corner on a nice little cushion an old bone or something that has been acquired in the Middle Ages. Whether or not they actually belong to saints is obviously impossible to prove, but it's a very important part of the practice of veneration and cult in the Middle Ages. So following the recovery of his skull by the bishopric of Magdeburg, the statue that you see on the slide here was commissioned in 2020 to 2020, why am I saying 20? I'm really sorry, between 1220 to 1240. So the date is not exactly sure, but around that time. And this statue is highly significant because it marks the earliest surviving portrayal of St. Maurice as clearly a Black man, with physical features marking him as someone from Africa. And I'd like to think of this statue as exemplifying the complex relationships that I've described before between the binarism of right belief, wrong belief, and the spectrum of physical difference. This statue is not simply of a Black man, it is a statue of a Black saint, a knight, a martyr. His armor denotes clearly a warrior of high status, and you can see that his left hand is missing something. It looks like it's holding something. It was probably a sword or a lance, but this has disappeared with time. And the statue is also placed near the grave of Otto I, so a meaningful reminder that Otto I made St. Maurice the protector of Magdeburg, as well as a patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire. And later representations of St. Maurice often show him with the Black Eagle of the Holy Roman Empire, really emphasizing this relationship between the saint and the empire. But Otto, as I mentioned, and as is on my slide, began this cult of St. Maurice in the 10th century. So why does the 13th century suddenly see a boom in these portrayals of St. Maurice? And specifically, these more realistic portrayals of St. Maurice as a Black man. The first very simple explanation is that the art of the period began to strive for more realistic features in its statues. Another possible explanation that has been considered, though to be fully honest with you, I'm not fully convinced by this one, is that there was a bigger proximity with fighters from Africa, specifically Christian Ethiopian fighters, on behalf of Christian knights in the 13th century, as the two groups would have met going on crusade to the Holy Land. As I said, I'm not too convinced by this because obviously, you know, the Roman Empire also reached into Africa, so there was a presence of Black people in Europe way before the Middle Ages. A more likely, albeit perhaps more cynical reasoning as to why these statues proliferate in the 13th century is that the empire and the emperors at the time continue a tradition that considered that portraying the variety of their subjects contributed to emphasizing their political imperial power. So the more diverse your subjects are, the bigger your empire and the bigger your political might. So the statue of St. Maurice in Magdeburg then is neither a utopian image of racial equality, nor a racist caricature portraying Blackness as a negative trait. It is simply a testimony to an egalitarianism afforded under the banner of Christianity in a medieval perspective, which in turn might have served imperial propaganda. A note that the portrayal of St. Maurice will continue to flourish in the late Middle Ages, roughly until the 16th century, when the advent of the transatlantic slave trade renders the veneration of a Black saint at odds with pseudo-scientific justifications for the exploitation of Black people. So this is my historical, semi-historical, again, when it's this early, we can never really tell exactly what is history, what is fiction. But this is the first example I wanted to discuss today. The second is the character of Theresies from the epic Parzival by the great Wolfram von Eschenbach. So Parzival is one of the most well-known texts of the German-speaking Middle Ages and one of the most well-known texts of an already very well-known author of the German-speaking Middle Ages, Wolfram von Eschenbach. It was composed in the first quarter of the 13th century. And it's based loosely on different traditions stemming from the French. The most prominent of these is the Perceval au Conte du Graal by Chrétien de Troyes, which forms really the core of Wolfram's retelling. In Wolfram's rendering, Chrétien's story is interlaced with a second narrative that is also unfinished about the knight Gawain. But what's important is that Wolfram significantly expands on both these narratives. So he extends them both forwards in time and backwards in time. So to give you an idea, recent editors have divided Wolfram's text in about 16 books, with books 3 to 14 being roughly the retelling of the story of Parzival following the French sources, and books 1, 2, and then 15 and 16 being these extrapolations in time. And what's very interesting in these extrapolations is that we can see, and I'm paraphrasing from Suzanne Conklin-Barry, who I already quoted earlier, we can see in these extrapolations the cosmographical matrix in which the Perceval story is embedded and in which the quest of Perceval appears at once as a personal journey and a universal history. So the main story of Perceval, and this is the first part of the extension of Wolfram, so the very beginning of the text, is preceded by the narrative of his father, called Garmouret, and followed by the story of Garmouret's grandsons, and that is at the end of the text. And Garmouret is the younger son of the king of Anjou. He's forced to make his own way into the world because following actual French legal practice, his older brother has inherited everything, so he doesn't have really much to do in the seat of his parents' power and has to go travel the world. And in the beginning of these travels, he ends up fighting for the Baroque of Baghdad, so the king of Baghdad, and going to the kingdom of Zazamank, so a fictional kingdom that is somewhere between Africa and the Near East. It's kind of difficult to locate. And he meets there the beautiful queen Belakane. Her beauty bewitches Garmouret. She is described as this beautiful black woman, and she herself is also bewitched by Garmouret's beauty and describes him as fair-skinned. And we are told by the narrator she had seen fair-skinned people before, so she knew he was particularly handsome for a fair-skinned person. So when they meet, Belakane insists that she's not married, and she tells him, so I'll read the Middle High German, but you have the modern German translation by Wolfgang Spivak at the bottom of the slide. So she tells him, Ich entwart nie wieb de heines man, Garmouretten duchte san, wie sie wäre an Hedenin, mit trüven siblicher Sien, in Wiebes Herze nie gesluf, ihr Küche was in Reine tuf, und auch der Regen, der sie begoss, der Wag, der von ihr Ugensloss, auf ihr Zobel und an ihr Brust. So while, as I mentioned, Belakane is described many times by the narrator as being black, this is clearly not what strikes Garmouret as potentially different here in this description, or it is not what seems to make him question for a second whether they should consummate the union. Rather, it's her lack of Christian faith. Wie sie wäre ein Hedenin, even though she was a heathen, as the word used says. The tears that are flowing on her face then, as she's recounting many attacks on her kingdom, act as kind of an informal, but true, we are told even pure in the Middle High German, reina, baptism. So this acts of crying is actually what kind of subtly makes her union with Garmouret possible. The two will marry, and Belakane falls pregnant, though before their son is born, Garmouret deserts her and he leaves a letter claiming that he cannot stay with her because, you guessed it, she's not a Christian. It's a slightly unconvincing reason in the text because Belakane is actually fully ready to convert for love of Garmouret, but he nonetheless leaves a letter and says, I can't be with you, you are not Christian. And he leaves her as she's about to give birth. And Belakane does give birth to their son, who we are told is half black and half white. Again, the modern German translation is at the bottom. Die Fruwe an rechte Ziet genas, ein Sohns, der zweie Farbe was, an dem Gott Wundes wat enein, wies und zwarze Wabe erschien. Die Königin kust in Sundetfall, viel dicke an sin blanken Mal, die Mutter hieß ihr Kinderlin, faire fies Archevin, als ein Agelster ward gewahr, sin Haar und auch sin Fell viel gar. So the birth of Ferefis, this moment, takes place at the end of the first book of the text, and Ferefis then recedes in the background as a character until the very end of the text in book 15, where after having gone on a series of adventures, the main hero, Perceval, encounters a great heathen warrior who he cannot defeat in battle. As Perceval believes that this mysterious heathen is about to kill him, the heathen decides to spare Perceval's life. And this very heathen warrior is then described als ein geschrieben Permint, schwarz und blank her und da. So as a parchment on which someone has written. So this warrior, you guessed it, is none other than Ferefis, Parzival's half-brother. The description of Ferefis as a written on parchment here is meaningful, first because it reinforces this black and white description, so the mix of his parents' skin color, but second because it symbolically echoes the letter left by Garmoret to Belakane. So the very body of Ferefis becomes this counterpart to the letter that was used to leave Belakane as an excuse, using as an excuse that she was not a Christian. So in this moment where Parzival and Ferefis meet and fight, they decide to lay down their weapons and they begin to talk, and they suddenly realize that they are indeed half-brothers. And it more or less goes like, oh, my father is Garmoret. Oh, my father is also Garmoret. And it's just kind of that simple, really, at that moment. And this has been described by many scholars as a striking moment when they recognize each other, of both mutual recognition, but also momentary and sudden collapse of the boundaries that normally separate Christian and heathens. As again, I'm using the Middle High German word equivalent. So at the moment where they realize that they are brothers, the narrator tells us, der Heiden sprach, der bin ich. Der Heiden schiere ward erkannt, wandertrog allgestern mal, Ferefis und Parzival mit Kusse und Stunden Haas. So the two brothers realize that the reason why they could not bring themselves to kill each other is because they are parts of a whole, so they are kind of the counterparts for each other. This strange kind of checkered body of Ferefis is again really emphasized. And when in coming face to face with his Christian brother, Ferefis comes up against the boundary that separates Christians and heathens, a boundary that is permeable, albeit in a one-way direction. And as the brothers continue to tell their story, and this will be familiar, Ferefis begins to cry. And we are told that sie heden schuugen begunden Wasser rehren, al nach der Tufes ehren. The parallel here with the description of Belakane's tears that I showed you earlier is difficult to miss. It's as if in moments of expressing love towards Christians, heathens are automatically, albeit informally, granted baptism. The tears signal the beginning of the formal process of conversion for Ferefis, who at the end of the text is indeed baptized. So Ferefis is welcomed into the community of the Grail. He becomes one of the Christian knights. So what I'm trying to show here with this example of Ferefis is that while his outward appearance symbolizes the union of a white knight with a black queen, the only sticky point that the narrative comes to correct or tries to correct is his belief system. Ferefis symbolically completes the opposite trajectory to his father Garmoret, who, although white, traveled towards Africa and the Middle East, and he behaves, by the way, in very dubious ways for a Christian knights, not least by marrying two women and leaving one behind with a son, but also in dubious ways for the Christian framework because he serves Muslim lords in many different ways. So Ferefis completes, as I said, the opposite trajectory to his father Garmoret, who as a Christian went to fight with heathen lords, where Ferefis in turn reunites with his brother and with the Christian religion of his father. So his conversion in the text acts as a kind of ultimate sign of assimilation of the other into the community of the text. And even beyond assimilation, the text ends with the stories of Parzival's son, as well as Ferefis' son, who is none other than Prester John, a very important figure in the medieval world, who carries on the work of converting all of India to Christianity, a task that his father had already undertaken as a convert. So what am I trying to discuss here with these two examples? To go back to modern appropriations of the Middle Ages, I'm trying to show that embracing the medieval heritage is not embracing either a pure white Middle Ages or a Middle Age of barbarity, but rather embracing the complexity with which people of different skin colors and different religions have been perceived throughout history. What I'm trying to show here is that the European discourse, the medieval European discourse on race and religion, shows that these are always approached with a range of complexity, relying on not only physical markers, but religious markers. And that the Middle Ages is perhaps just left to be understood in a medieval lens. Thank you very much.